The question, who am I, might have first been asked in a profound and personal way in 386 AD by an ambitious, successful 32-year-old man on the cusp of an even greater career. Having risen from humble beginnings to become the public orator of Milano in Italy, a highly esteemed position, he seemed destined for greatness. Yet, despite his external success, he was suddenly overwhelmed by a deep internal crisis about his identity. In his autobiography, he confessed, I quote, "I had placed myself behind my own back, refusing to see myself." This man, wrestling with inner turmoil, described his, I quote, "inner self was a house divided against myself," end quote, and he became so distraught that he was, I quote, "behind myself, beside myself with madness," end quote, treating his personality like being beside himself, tearing his hair and striking his forehead in despair. It was only when he believed he heard the voice of God urging him to take up and read the Bible that he found salvation for his anguish. In that moment, he experienced what he described as a profound rebirth, transforming into a new person through conversation with God and through conversion to Christianity. This man was nobody else and nobody less than Saint Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo. You certainly know him as Saint Augustine, who would go on to become one of the most influential thinkers and clerics of his time. His dramatic spiritual crisis, culminating in conversion, marked a pivotal moment not only in his life but also in the broader history of Western thought. Augustine's history or story, his very autobiography, aptly titled as Confessiones, Confessions, stands as the first recorded example of an individual deeply at odds with both his culture and his own inner self, a precursor to Western fascination with question of personal identity and self-discovery. For Augustine, the answer to "who am I?" was found in his conversion to Catholic Church. In the centuries that followed, others would search for their own answers, some finding satisfaction in their discoveries, others not. But none would ever provide a conclusive resolution. Welcome to Orientalistics, podcast on language, culture, and religion. This episode, Identity in Times of Crisis, Part 3, Identity and Language, the Quest of Self. Hi everybody, you're listening to Farshid. In this episode, I'm going to continue the topic on language and identity. In the previous episode, I delved into the fundamental relationship between these two concepts. How our speech, our self-expression, and the way we present ourselves to others are deeply connected to our identity. Whether it is among friends and family, in professional settings, or even during those first moments when we meet someone new, the language we choose reflects the side of ourselves we wish to show, we wish to demonstrate, and we wish to be shown as such. It shapes how we position ourselves socially, how we select or reject friendships, and how we convey who we are to the world around us. So it's clear that language and identity are incredibly and irresistibly linked, yet in this second episode I'm aiming to take things a step further, offering a more detailed exploration of this bond. We'll delve into how our political, cultural, and even religious identities shape and are shaped by the language we use and implement. And to ground this discussion, I'll be sharing some real-world examples that illustrate just how interconnected these elements truly are. So let's start with a concept that might be even familiar to you. Self-doubt. Despite the seemingly undeniable reality of the self, serious contemplations can still lead to nagging questions about what that self actually is. In this blend of body, mind, soul, instinct, logic, and imagination that we label with our names, what really constitutes the truest essence of us? Are the impulses and desires we undeniably feel the most essential parts of us? Or is our core identity found in something more elusive, like an inner sense of spirituality? Does our self inside in the ego that plans and recalls, or is it rooted in our ability to dream and imagine, or perhaps in our primal feelings of lust and fear? Can we discover how we truly are only when we are alone? Or is our identity shaped through the reflections of those around us? And do we remain the same person we were as children, or do we change day by day? What if all our memories were wiped clean, or if our face changed so dramatically that even we wouldn't recognize ourselves in a mirror? And what if somehow someone else's memories or face were substituted for our own? I mean, they're just hypotheses. Take these questions a step further. What if we were completely paralyzed and unable to communicate, or in a like a kind of science fiction twist, if our mind were placed in the body of an animal, a fly? What about zombies robbed of soul and will? Or even more, let's say realistically, what happens to the self when the brain is gone but the body lives on? These thought experiments lead us to a fundamental problem. What exactly is the me? And what about the selves of others? How different are they from my own? How do identities of people of different races, ethnicities, genders, or cultural backgrounds diverge from mine? And could machines, animals, or even trees have selves? Then there are the odd cases when we claim we are not ourselves. As an idiom, when we are so exhausted, tired, and plagued by fatigue, intoxicated or angry that we might say, I don't know who we are, or we are beside ourselves. What about that moment? If we aren't ourselves in those moments I mentioned, then who are we? Can we be held responsible for our actions when we didn't know what we were doing? If not, who is responsible? And what of those who appear delusional, those who believe they are Jesus Christ or Messiah or Imam? How different are they from us? Is their reality as real or as unreal as ours? How responsible are they for their thoughts and actions? Let me bring this example a little bit more tangible. Consider people who claim to have multiple personalities, remember past lives, or say they are possessed by demons or have been abducted by aliens, or those who go into trances and channel supramental entities. Then there are those who feel trapped in the wrong body, men who insist they are women, and women who truly insist they are really men. How do we fit these extraordinary beliefs and experiences into our understanding of personal identity? Moreover, if the self is a composite of various parts, some of which may change with time and circumstances, it's possible that we can be in conflict with ourselves, don't we? We can deceive ourselves, sin against ourselves, and even lose ourselves, becoming someone entirely different. Our everyday language reflects this. For example, when I say, I was fooling myself, or I'm only hurting myself, or when I say, I don't feel like myself, or I'm beside myself, I'm not myself, or I can't stop myself. What is this self? And because in modern society, particularly the West, authenticity is often held as the highest virtue, it follows that we must consistently and constantly wrestle with these conflicts, with these ambivalences and changes in order to stay true to what truly we believe it's our deepest, most genuine self. Yet the quest for purity in our sense of self being its own challenges and brings particular new challenges. How can we ever be sure that our thoughts, emotions, desires, and memories truly belong to us? Perhaps we have been conditioned to embrace the ambitions and plans handed to us by parents, teachers, or employees, influential friends, social media, dreams that might, in fact, erode our genuine identity. Maybe the recognition we seek from others or expectations they impose forces us to act in ways that betrays our true selves, trapping us in a version of ourselves that isn't authentic. It could be that society itself, with its rules and commands and codes and codexes, ultimately alienates us from who we really are. This notion that we must strip away from the socially imposed masks to uncover our authentic selves is a recurring theme, especially in the self-help literature that lines the shelves of bookstores today, in Amazon or elsewhere, in the real physical bookstores. But even if we could peel away everything that seems to be false and imposed, what would be truly left from us? What would our purified, authentic selves consist of once freed from the past and the demands of others? Some modern thinkers and gurus argue that such purification could lead to a mystical communion with a higher power, or for the more secular-minded people, to a discovery of the true foundation of our being, something that would supposedly make us more productive, happier, more cheerful, and more self-aware. But there is also a less comforting possibility that without the familiar structures of our history and social conditioning, we might find ourselves adrift, facing anxiety, even terror, as we float without anchor in a void, in an emptiness. Now, whether this unraveling of social identity would lead to ecstasy, panic, or both, the reality is that the markers that once gave clear boundaries to our sense of self are becoming increasingly blurred in today's modern world. One of the most striking examples of this blurring idea comes from, or concept comes from, the rise of technology. The line between ourselves and the machines we create is getting harder to distinguish, as those machines have now reached levels of sophistication previously were in fact unimaginable. Experts in AI, artificial intelligence, are now seriously exploring the possibility of building machines that could rival human capabilities and possibilities. If such machines can be created, and convincingly they're going to, it raises the understanding in a very new dimension, and with that, the unsettling question of so whatever we as humans are not any more than, let's say, biological machines ourselves. Perhaps we are just like these machines, made not of mental but of flesh, without biological equivalents or of their logic chips, implanted memories and programmed emotions. If you dismantle the wiring, just hypothetically, all that's left is a pile of scrap metal in one case, and in the other, simply dead flesh, if you compare. The boundary between human and machine begins to fade. A scenario made famous in some science fiction movies. And if this is true, it's difficult to deny that the mention of the self might be nothing more than an illusion. But if that's the case, who is right now at this very moment pronouncing these words you're listening to? And who is this, if is it not you genuinely listening to me? These metaphysical questions, along with many others, arise when we begin to probe the nature of identity. They lead us into the dazzling complexities of what it means to claim individuality in the modern world. These questions and the broader issues surrounding the nature of being are central to our contemporary condition. They'll continue to surface throughout this discussion, offering a pathway to critically and creatively maybe engage with our own sense of self. And I will be talking a lot about this word, self. Whether the self is real or even illusory. In exploring these issues of identity, we also open the door to broader discussions about the relationship between individual psychology and the cultural context in which it exists. There are the central questions that we will guide and that would guide us, in fact, through this ongoing narrative. Now, let's turn to the philology of the term, or terms like self and identity, with particular attention to the first one, the word self. There are significant cultural and linguistic differences in how the concept of self is understood in Western societies versus other cultures. However, before delving into this contrast, it is critical to question whether the notion of self is a valid analytical category to begin with. Some scholars have raised doubts and uncertainty about its universality. In German, for example, the words like selber or selbst, as well as in Swedish the word själv, or Norwegian selv, all meaning self, they do not function as nouns in the same way that the word self does in English. This differences suggest that the concept of self, the word self, particularly as a noun, is not universal. These linguistic variations indicate that using self as a noun might reflect an Anglo-Saxon ethnocentric bias. Philologists and linguists have critiqued the use of the self in anthropological discourse, suggesting that it imposes a distinctly Anglo-American framework on other cultures' modes of thought and expression. Some linguists take this critique even further, arguing that the concept of the self is a culture-specific construct, perhaps only fully developed in English. A more universal and perhaps neutral term might be person, which is found across languages and typically refers to a living, thinking, knowing, recognizing, desiring, feeling, speaking, and hearing being. In contrast to the word self, the idea of a person avoids the cultural baggage associated with individualism and selfhood that permeates much of Western thought. These critics hold significant weight even within the English-speaking world. The notion of the word self as an active agent, as a grammatical category with distinct identity, is a relatively recent development. I have been searching for the history of this notion as a grammatical category, as a noun. In English and other Germanic languages, the word self was primarily used as a reflexive pronoun. I mean, I, myself. Until around 13th century. Over time, however, the term self evolved into a substantive as a noun and came to be widely used in its modern sense. One of the most famous early examples of this shift and semantic change in usage of the word self is found in John Locke's seminal work called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, that was written in 1690, where the philosopher John Locke defined the self as that conscious thinking thing concerned for itself as far as the consciousness extends. End quote. Locke's definition on the word self as a singular, enduring entity, a continuous being that persists over time and through various experiences, has profoundly shaped the Western understanding of identity. This so-called Lockean self, with its clear boundaries and capacity for intersection, and in this perspective, became central to Western philosophy. But not only Western philosophy, but also psychology and anthropology. Many scholars argue that this conception of the self can be empirically studied and understood. However, when we turn to non-Western cultures, we see that the idea of the self as an isolated, self-aware entity is far from universal. In many cultures, the sense of identity is more relational and, let's say, collective, shaped by social roles and responsibilities rather than an individual's internal consciousness. Thus, while the word self in Western context carries with it assumptions of autonomy, continuity, and kind of introspection, these attributes may not be globally applicable as once thought. The critique of the word self as an analytical category encourages us to approach the study of identity with a, let's say, broader, more culturally sensitive perspective, recognizing that different languages and cultures may frame identity in ways that don't align with Western individualism. Yet the question remains, how many selves are we actually dealing with? For example, the famous German-American psychologist Ulrich Neisser says people everywhere feel themselves to be unitary and coherent individuals. He differentiates between 5 different selves, which can be summarized as ecological self, so kind of a bodily experience, interpersonal self, which is for communication, the remembered self, this is the memory, the private self, this is the internal consciousness, and finally the conceptual self, the cultural models. Equally fascinating is how linguistic anthropology traces the development of the word self from its fusion with the clan during ritual roles to its later individuation, particularly in Roman society and under the influence of early Christianity. The evolution from persona as a public role to a deeper moral and metaphysical concept of the self demonstrates how language and culture shape our understanding of personal identity. In linguistic anthropology, for example, the transformation of self or the self from a role-playing entity within a community to a moral, spiritual being with inherent value parallels major historical shifts from ancient Rome to the era of Enlightenment and Protestantism. This trajectory points to a profound shift in how we see ourselves, not just as individuals, but as moral and spiritual beings with responsibilities that transcends societal roles. Other scholars categorize the semantic spectrum of self differently, dividing that into other categories. For example, a self that is experimental, it's just I and me. And then there is a self which is individual, it's a kind of species specific aspects, including, of course, the language that we apply. And finally, the person, this is the public role of self. The distinction between self, individual, and person highlight that identity is not merely about introspection, but is also influenced by our roles in society. Kind of species specific traits like language and cultural experiments and expectations that are imposed upon us. The words we choose to define self carry immense weight, shaping how we view ourselves and, of course, others, and ultimately determining the scope of that we are going to consider as identity. Our discussion of these frameworks might offer a new venue for further episodes where one could delve even further into how various cultures and philosophies perceive identity differently. The evolution of the self from a public mask to an introspective entity opens up fascinating discussions on morality, culture, and human experience. I hope that's still is it really scratching on the surface, but I hope that it gave you kind of some food for thought. And don't forget to tune in for the next episode, where I'm going to dive a little bit more deeper into these ideas of identity and language. And if you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it with your family and friends. And please don't forget to just get back to me if you have questions. And I'm happy to be responsive to that. Until next time, take care and bye.